Thank you everyone for coming to our talk and conversation today for Rindon Johnson's exhibition, Best Synthetic Answer, upstairs. And my name is Joni Zhu. I am the head of programs and research at the Rockbund Art Museum, where we opened a show back in September, and which is also when Rindon's avatar, as featured on the 4th floor in the work Best Synthetic Answer #1, started swimming from San Francisco to Shanghai. Now, as halfway through this virtual trans-Pacific journey, it's really so exciting to be welcoming Rindon back to the museum physically for this talk and conversation. And with even greater pleasure this time, we have our friend Sheau Yun Lim here, who will be giving a talk and also be in conversation with the artist later after talk, and myself. So to give some biographical parameters, I would like to introduce Sheau. Sheau is an independent curator, writer, and designer based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and also Cambridge, Massachusetts. She is the co-founder of Cloud Projects, which is a curatorial and publisher collective working between art, architecture, and history based in Kuala Lumpur and Penang in Malaysia. She's also the lead researcher for Malaysia Design Archive, which is a project to map the development of graphic design in Malaysia from the period before independence in 1957 until now. And Rindon Johnson, who is an artist and poet, moving between physical and virtual spaces. Rindon's multidisciplinary practice is grounded in language, in its multiplicities, its failures, and its contradictions, and its also systemic powers. His work uses this grounding to examine how the effects of capitalism, climate, and technology construct our realities. At times, Rindon focuses on specific words, latching onto the words that mark changes or differences like byproduct, five, and trans. He uses these linguistic studies to move both towards and away from abstraction simultaneously. He wonders what can bring us together and what pulls us apart. His combination of word, technology, and object creates multi-layered works. His forms of expression range from publishing and virtual reality to leather, wood, and stone. Rindon has presented solo exhibitions throughout Europe and United States, most recently in Dresden at Albertinum, Chisenhall Gallery in London, and Sculpture Center in New York. Rindon has participated in group exhibitions worldwide, most recently at the 60th International Exhibition of Venice Biennial. Rindon is the author of 4 books of poetry and prose, most recently, The Law of Large Numbers, Black Sonic Abyss, published in 2021, and Ever Given, which is published in 2022. He lives between New York and Berlin and is currently the visiting professor in the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Studies at Harvard University, where him and Sheau met at a class Writing Near Art and Art Near Writing. So over to you, Sheau.
Hi, okay. Thank you so much everyone for being here. I will read a short piece that I wrote in response to the exhibition, and then after that we'll sort of broaden the conversation. Synthetic, reproduction, imitation, of a substance made by chemical synthesis, especially to imitate a natural product. Just down the Pacific Coast Highway of Rin's childhood, Los Angeles is burning. The hills are in flames, tinderboxes caught alight as global warming dries up Southern California. In the past 6.5 months, Los Angeles has received just 4 millimeters of rain. Climate change has invaded the West. No one is safe. But some say algae will save us all. Algae of the seaweed and kelp variety. Algae is being touted as the latest method of carbon sequestration. Here's how it works. In the open ocean, kelp is grown on ropes that float on the surface of water. They photosynthesize as they grow, absorbing sunlight and carbon dioxide, gigatons of it. Giant kelp, the preferred species for sequestration, can grow up to 53 meters or 175 feet long, equivalent to about a 12-story building floating in the water. Once they've reached maturity, they are cut off from the surface of the water and sink to the bottom of the deep ocean, where there isn't enough oxygen for them to decompose. They sit there, dead biomasses on the seafloor, indigestible by ocean life, designed to contain carbon until humans can get their shit together. In parts of the North Pacific Ocean below 2,100 meters, that's a lease of about 750 years. Forget the trees, carbon traders say. We have kelp and the unconquered territory of the open waters. Don't plant a tree for every water bottle that gets thrown away. Plant a seaweed. It grows faster anyway. Material histories often tell us materialist histories. Kelp ventures are already selling carbon credit futures, creating a balance sheet on a possibility. One of them claims, we can get back to pre-industrial levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. At least one private foundation is selling a blockchain kelp coin. As primary forests are being destroyed, raise a suburb of mid-density towers growing in the ocean. The corporate carbon math is working out. Given enough time, and by that I mean millennia, this kelp can become the next great reserve of oil. Maybe next we'll figure out how to accelerate that process. As a child, Rin swam through giant kelp columns that live off the rocky coastlines of San Francisco. These seaweed columns sway with the waves and are home and hunting ground to urchins, otters, and rockfish. Kelp are loose creatures in the water, continuously shedding their fronds and knocked loose into the open current by heavy storms. Loose kelp is everywhere, beach onto the shore, floating among coral. Once knocked loose, kelp, like any other organic material, will begin to decompose, releasing its stored carbon dioxide. Rin told me that he once spoke to a kelp scientist who expressed concern over whether it was ethical to grow kelp for carbon sequestration. Giant kelp used for carbon sequestration is a genetically modified product designed to retain as much carbon as possible. Therefore, it is designed to hold shape, it cannot break down, and it cannot reproduce. The scientist who spoke to him wondered, am I taking away this life form's ability to feel, to have sex, to live the fullness of its organismal experience? Kelp for carbon is a eunuch seaweed, but the latest frontier in our quest to produce utilitarian life forms. Its only function is to be bloated, absorbing the consequences and compensating for our carbon emissions. It is a monocrop answer that speaks the language of the plantation, the only language of cultivation that empire and industry know. Synthetic. The generative. Life between the human and the machine. In Rin's exhibition, we first see algae as algae leather curtains. The work is titled A Big White Dog Cloud in 4 parts. It is titled that way because in the UK, depression is referred to as a black dog, thanks to Winston Churchill. And Sydney, Rin's daughter, upon hearing this, told Rin that she only ever wanted white dogs. Smaller sheets of the algae leather are sewed together at the ends to form a continuous vertical strip, one that is pushed aside upon entry into the building. It looks like the curtains of industry used to maintain conditioned spaces. But if you squint, with its light green curled in upon itself and its opacity created with overlap, it almost looks like bamboo. Not an iron curtain, not a batik curtain, but a bamboo curtain. It is tough, and one might say leathery, when you touch its surface, but it does not fall like leather. In the 3 leather paintings upstairs, the paint puckers into the grain, soft to touch. Algae leather is stiff against the skin, likely to chafe. It does not yield. If leather is a byproduct of the meat industry, then algae leather is a byproduct of the moral consciousness of the liberal subject. Rin's 2019 video, among other things, is interspersed with clips of bulls being cornered by people. In each clip, a bull sits in the middle of a ring of humans as they taunt, laugh, kick, incite, all cosplaying flaccid versions of a matador. The bulls are increasingly agitated, clearly in pain, and clearly overwhelmed. A cello plays. The video is hard to watch. Algae leather, then, is what promises a way out of this suffering. The laboratory instead of the meat farm, the plant instead of the cattle. Algae leather is a moral material, supported even by PETA. By this measure, distance to the status of the human is determined by a sliding scale of our observation of their suffering. We see pain in the animal's eyes, but the plant, unable to vocalize, is not extended the same sympathy. Giorgio Agamben, in his idea of bare life, argues that people are reduced to their biological existence and subjected to violence without consequence. The sheer biological fact of existence has outstripped in importance the way a life is led. He sees from the view of the totalizing system. Alexander Wehelier, responding to Agamben's ideas, foregrounds the fact of race. He argues, the barring of subjects that belong to the Homo sapiens species from the jurisdiction of humanity depends upon the workings of racialization, i.e. differentiation, and racism, i.e. hierarchization and exclusion. In fact, the two are indistinguishable. He continues, the particular assemblage of humanity under the purview here is habeas viscus, you shall have the flesh in Latin, which in contrast to bare life insists on the importance of minuscule movements, glimmers of hope, scraps of food, the interrupted dreams of freedom found in those spaces deemed devoid of full human life. Guantanamo Bay, internment camps, maximum security prisons, Indian reservations, concentration camps, slave plantations, or colonial outposts, for instance. One could add to this list any number of sites across the Pacific Ocean. Where is the machine, then, in this spectrum? Can we give the machine some sympathy, some life? Rin's avatar swims continuously through the water. It's tireless, braving the weather, keeping its form, its legs continuously kicking. The avatar, it, is wearing a little black bikini, maybe on a 7-month vacation, meant for exhaustion rather than restoration. We know, of course, that this moving image is made by a machine, but there it is, on a very real journey on its own, a moving dot traversing the conditions of oceanic distance. As we walked into the 4th floor room to watch Rin's avatars swim yesterday, the music was perfectly uncanny. It sounded composed. It was anticipatory, an electronic funk synthesis of the jazz Rin had entered into AVA, a deep learning music composition program. It captured the strangeness of the image, the lack of resolution in the render. But it only lasted 3 more minutes before it defaulted back to its odd, generic ambient AI. Rin mentioned that he tried for a week to get the movement sensing technology to work. The technology was made to reflect off white, and it could not sense his skin. It took his partner, who was white, a day to get it to work. After a moment of serendipity, the generated music stopped being generative. The synthetic, an object of synthesis, from the Greek synthetikos, based on synthethenai, to place together, the alloy, the composite. In the exhibition, algae returns to us in its raw form in the bottom floor. The space is sparse. We are in the deep. It is pitch black, save for the photoluminescence of a glowing blue box filled with water, and 35mm slides of Rin's childhood pictures. In the blue box, bits of algae float in the water, glowing pink to indicate to us that they are still alive. Down the hallway, the 35mm slides click through Rin's family photographs. In Hawaii with the blue, blue water. His dad is smiling big, cornered by the camera. Everyone gets piggybacks in the shallow water. Surf's up. Mimicking the bottom of a sea floor, I think of the bottom floor of the exhibition as addressing the elemental. It is a container for the most basic blocks of life. Yesterday, Sydney pointed at a picture of a Rin as a teenager and said, "That's Daddy." A pink glow, love, and recognition. Best Synthetic Answer asks, how does a Black American raised on the edge of the Pacific move through the ocean to reach Shanghai? But it also asks, what are the conditions that produce and sustain life? We live in a world marked by loss of body, of mind, and life. We do not shirk from the legacies of colonialism, racism, empire. But remember the elemental, the fundamental. The work is in making it sensible. Let it move you. The best answer is necessarily synthetic, because a world without synthesis is no longer possible.
Thank you so much, Sheau. Before we kind of started kind of really thinking about what the conversation is going to be geared around it, I would love just for you to kind of tell us a little bit more about your experience going into the space yesterday, because I think some of the audience might be coming back to hear the talk after seeing the exhibitions over the past couple of months, but also as somebody who just saw the exhibition yesterday in person, I would love for you to share a little bit more about your experience with the exhibition yesterday.
Yeah, that's a big question. Let's see. I think I was very unexpectedly moved, especially at the end of the exhibition. I had seen a sort of WhatsApp video version of the exhibition, thanks to Joni here. But what really struck me was the sort of, especially in the bottom floor, the sparseness of the space. You're kind of transported into the sort of void itself. I was telling Rin that there's something very architectural in particular about how the exhibition is put together. With the very specific viewpoints from the 6.4-degree leather sofa that one is meant to lie on as one views the sort of Avatar cruise, across the Pacific, or even the sort of darkness of space with a sort of like one tunnel of light at the end. And there's a sort of like sensory reality to the physical experience. Even the smell, honestly, of the algae in the bottom floor, that was like not unpleasant, that I really, really enjoyed. So, yeah. No.
Let's stay with the algae. And Ring, can we please read out the title for the algae tank, please?
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that reading. I really appreciate it. Okay. So
It's on page
10.
10. Okay.
The algae piece is called Best Synthetic Answer number 3.5. Protocol Converter Prototype. Wanders included, or use becomes natural, or employees you don't have to pay, or environmentalism does not usually address colonialism and often reproduces it. Undergird. Sure. New feeling. Can't hear it cry out. Contrivance. Rube Goldberg Streetlight. Under commonality. Inevitably, the strain of our desire will break things down. A functional proposition, a system of base measure, hubris, marker, stain. What level can you see through? Magnificent drain, silent noise, prose, yuck, square drift, laborian, pollution, scientific ways to know pollution, and actions to mitigate pollution are not examples of symptoms or metaphors for or unintentional byproducts of colonialism, but rather are essential parts of the interlocking logics, brain, mechanisms, hands and teeth, and structures, hearts and bones. Colonialism is not just about taking land, though it certainly includes taking land. Stealing is a manifestation, a symptom, a mechanism, and even a goal of colonialism. But those are the teeth of colonialism, and I want to look at its bones. Stealing land and dispossessing people are events with temporal edges, but ongoing land theft requires maintenance and infrastructure that are not as discrete, given that colonization is a continuing process, not simply a historical event. Colonialism is a set of specific, structured, interlocking, and overlapping relations that allow these events to occur, make sense, and even seem right to some.
Thank you. And upon listening to your talk, Sheau, what I was thinking in relation to how Rindon is writing the title for this work and how you were talking about the algae, that we're stripping reproducibility of the algae, we're stripping away from the condition for which an organism can thrive in an environment, away in order for the environment to become better, which is in the title where when you talk about environmentalism is often does not address colonialism and anything, but actually reproduces it. I would love for you both to elaborate it on this point with your own taking.
You want to go first? I think I want to answer this in a way that doesn't feel as straightforward as it felt to me or something. It almost feels like for environmentalism to function, its base parts are the same as the things that seek to destroy the environment, and that really confused me in a lot of ways. And it almost feels like the endless spiral of the master's tools cannot destroy the master's house. And the issue is that I want to live in a house, and I don't really know how to sort through that. And so in many ways, the way that I was thinking about the title of this piece was I wanted to make a street light, but I realized that actually you can't, the point is that I shouldn't be allowed to see at night, actually, that like in the desire to try and even make an organism do something that I want it to do, I'm actually doing the thing that I am against. And so suggesting that there's any way of living that could be neutral is, it's impossible. There is no neutrality or something like this. And I guess that I was trying to play out a little bit in the title, which is also like partially plagiarized from Laborian as well. So it's like not even really my writing also. So there's that too. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which we kind of only know the answers of monocrop because that's the logic of empire, the logic of industry. but also in many ways the only mass solution to the mass problem, the hyper object that is all around us. As a sort of example, from building materials, cross-laminated timber is really seen as this like way in which we can use wood to build at scale. You know, like there'll be hopefully eventually 40-story towers made of mass timber. But cross-laminated timber, for one thing, is also a monocrop sort of a tree. It's oftentimes spruce or Douglas fir that's laminated together and glued essentially glued together in layers in order to produce the kind of like big structure. Someone I know compared it to basically Botoxing wood. And in that way, neutrality really is impossible, right? Like down to the way in which we live our kind of modern lives, palm oils and everything we eat, the sort of plantation economy is all around us. But I do think that there is a virtue, maybe, and ethics in making those things sensible and visible and knowable. And yeah, that's it.
Down to the way in which we live our lives is, I wanted to hold on to that note for a little bit, just because yesterday when I was sending Wu Laoshi, which is our interpreter over there, on life, I accidentally typed life with a big L, with a capital L. And life in Chinese can either be translated to life as one's life, you know, the one that we are being given by whoever that's given us the life, or the way we live our life. So 生命 or 生活. As you were talking about the material history, I was also thinking about what is the life of the material, and also what's the materiality of life, which perhaps is two parallel questions. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that that's maybe the question of what is the materiality of life is kind of animating a lot of my practice, I think. And it's a lot of why I end up with materials that have so much to do with the Bay Area and with San Francisco, because I'm like, well, this is what I know of life, of my beginnings of life. And it's actually why I ended up using glulam redwood for the Transamerica building, was because I was curious about what happens if I try and make redwood, this like strong and beautiful wood, do something that is completely senseless, that no one would ever ask it to do, which is like to have a long, tall span and to do any of these things that are unnecessary. Like a wood that beautiful doesn't need Botox. And at the same time, in the process of doing that, it became also very clear that the material history of this wood was so fraught that trying to make it more beautiful was also doing the thing that I did not want to do or something. So in my pursuit of trying to figure out what the materiality of life was, I was reproducing the thing that I was most afraid of doing, just by accident. And so I guess the like long-winded way to answer that question is I'm not sure, but I feel like I'm desperately trying to name it, and in that process what ends up happening is that the reply that I get from viewers is their understanding of what it means to live. And somehow in that conversation between the two of us, there's, I don't know, something else happens. And I guess that always ends up seeming to feel like the most parts of the work for me or something. So maybe that's what the materiality is this like constant conversation between me and the viewers.
When I think of the purity of life, I think of texture. I think of the sort of very felt, the surface of the carpet, the sort of like way in which the sort of like concrete wraps around, the light passing through a building, or I hope the mirror piece that is working right now. But thinking about the materiality of life, I think really comes down to a question of sensation and of aesthetics. And that is why I will continue to believe in a kind of aesthetic vocabulary as sort of an aesthetic truth with a small t, not a big T. But conversely, the kind of life of a material, I think we live in supply chains, right? The materials travel far greater distances than many of us will in our lifetimes in order to get to our hands and our feelings. There's a sort of a contradiction between the microscopicness with which we feel and the macroscopicness with which the world and the sort of cartographic functions. And maybe the sort of question of 生命 versus 生活 happens in those in-betweens, the sort of desires of the system and of a kind of like 命运 of fate, and the everyday mundanity with which we interact with the world around us.
I was thinking when I first started working with the cows that I thought maybe I could pull them out of the system that they were in, that like by working with furniture leather or vegetable tan leather, I could turn them into this thing that had far more value than like a shoe or a sofa. And of course, like that reinscribes my understanding of value, or like the understanding of value that would give it a number, like a number that's higher than a price, like a number that is a price. And I don't know, it feels funny now to be so committed to this thing, thinking that I was pulling it out of a system, but rather I was just like bringing it into a different type of system. And who am I to choose the hierarchy of system that gives something value? But I still do it.
Yeah, there's this question of surplus, in art, whether art is really just a sort of question of material elevation into a surplus value.
I would also say it's the same for this work too. It's alive, literally swimming in a pool of data, which that materiality is invisible from the screen, but is so acutely kind of important to the making of the work and the collection of information and the slicing of information and data and all of it. And that's also literally the life of the material is in that work too. And also in relation to Sheau, what you said in the second part, also the question of life, the question of bare life and machine. And in a way that, Rin, when you were talking about the different kind of systems and listening to you, Sheau, talking about the machine, in a way the machine is more of a dynamic concept as opposed to systems and structures. And that work allowed the life, the digital life, the virtual life, to be able to swim in a very dynamic, non-structural, but condition in which it's encompassing of the reality of the oceanic life too.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to default back again to a kind of question of architecture, but in the realm of architecture, so much building information is required to put something up that there have been this entire sort of group of flexible systems, both in terms of structures and in terms of building information that have been created. So, for example, the CCTV building in Beijing, it was actually, the structure that holds it up exists on the surface of the building itself. It's a sort of lattice structure that crystallizes essentially and holds the structure up together. But because of the sort of complexity of the form, they would, the sort of architects and engineers, it was designed by OMA and engineered by Arab, had this continuous process of rendering the building in these models again and again and again and again until they could find the optimum structural lattice to basically hold up this crystal shell. And it was one of the sort of earliest applications of the sort of continuous rendering and continuous modeling process on a kind of architectural scale. So, I mean, dealing with these sort of systems, I think, also have begun to evade our own sort of like perceptions of their fixity, you know. We live in a world where systems can become so invisible to us. I mean, oftentimes they are invisible to us, and we are made to sort of live in this frictionless environment where we don't realize that they are there. Yeah, I can't remember the rest.
Yeah, I think a lot about friction, actually, and like what the purpose of friction is, and then more specifically the fact that friction has to be introduced to some, but friction is well known to others. And I feel like poetry as a form can bring friction forth quite quickly. It's like in a very efficient way to bring about friction, which is one of the reasons why I'm so interested in it. You can really mess around with someone with language in that way, but I also feel like friction is it's evidence of something, like rubbing up against another thing, and that also feels like a really fascinating space, I suppose, and allows a little bit for, I don't know, for some room to look at living in life. Yeah.
The work that Sheau was talking about earlier, hopefully that we can see the sun reflecting onto the building. It's titled Best Synthetic Answer Number 3, Protocol Converter Prototype, which is a work that does not have the poem as a title, interestingly, but I found you were writing about it in Ever Given, which I'm going to read out. Maybe best not to start like trying to find the sun that's happening on the other side of the building. It's just reflecting on the window across the way. Isn't that enough of to say that we've been seeing it? Which is not particularly about that work, but it's about that series of you working with buildings and reflections and the relationship I wanted to talk about is the relationship of the way you're writing through your practice and then building it into the series of work and also your poems. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those decisions are being made? What gets to be included as a poem, as for the title? Yeah.
I don't have the capacity to standardize things in a way that makes too much sense, which is unfortunate because it means I can't answer your question well, I think, but I'm going to try. With this work, I think there's kind of, I find myself always trying to make works that are not fully visible ever, and of course that makes sense with Best Synthetic Answer number 1. But with the light-based works, I really liked the idea of chance being at play in the work, and I almost felt that it was like very necessary for the show to have a work that was like totally 100% chance-based, that we could never time properly, that we were that was completely out of our control. And so I like the idea of letting go of control with the work. It's why the cows made so much sense. It's why working with data makes so much sense. And these light-based pieces are maybe like the most, I guess purity makes no sense, but they're the purest form of it, you know, in that way. And when it comes to titling them or playing around with them, I really struggle actually with titling them. It's so much easier to title a leather work that I've been touching and playing with for months and years because I kind of know it and all the language can come very quickly and the language that I generally collect in my day-to-day fits it. But this sort of sudden surprise, it's almost like, it's like, what do you call that certain moment of sensation, which is why often their titles are odd and don't really gel the way that the other titles do, because they almost feel outside of my own visual language, but I desire them, so I make them. So yeah, so they're kind of perplexing to me. They confuse me.
I mean, this question in relation to control is also interesting. So as Joni mentioned, Rin and I met in this class at Harvard titled Writing Your Art, Art Your Writing. And it was a sort of week-by-week series of experimental writing. I think would be maybe the closest way to describe what we did. But we would read fiction, poetry, I mean, anything that was interesting, pretty much. And every week we would have these prompts that maybe, you know, write about a homophone or go into a YouTube spiral and sort of write a poem that emerges out of that. So there is also, I think, a kind of freedom in letting go of that control, but also a necessary sort of connection to the affective, the human, in a sort of situation and semester where a lot of academic work desires a kind of like rational being, you know, like this kind of writing desires a fundamentally irrational mind to produce. And yeah, there's a sort of way in which that is a generative process, right? Like there's, I was thinking about this in relation to some of the sort of large language models that you also like to play with. It comes from a machine that is the subconscious, and in that way it is generated, but it also becomes generative for a kind of like different mode of understanding. And in contrast to that, I think a lot of the sort of like, you know, language that we know from ChatGPT can feel very generated, and there's a sort of full stop, a kind of dead end. And if there's a machine-like quality to the way in which you write, I think that's the place where it comes from. Yeah, this generative space.
Generative space, also that work, that title starts with language as virus. Yeah, viral organism, viral, latch onto a body in order to reproduce, but it's suppressed on the 3rd floor, but then language is a virus on the 4th and 5th floor. Yeah, tell us more.
That title actually comes from Daniel Immerwahr's book, which animates a lot of this show. But basically, it's the chapter where he's talking about the way that English was used throughout the world, basically, virally, to destroy different cultures, different ideas, etc. And it was and remains a virus. And the power of just sort of standardizing how people speak then standardizes how people think. And the fact that it's demanded that one translate themselves into this space feels terrifying to me, quite frankly. But at the same time, it's also, I don't know, there's a bit also at play with the Tower of Babel too, that like parable that we used to all speak the same language and then God didn't like it and so decided that our languages needed to be split and only God would be the one to understand all of us. And this idea that understanding must be linguistic remains confusing to me and feels very anti-human or something. Like it feels absurd, like understanding feels elemental or something, which I guess is kind of, yeah, some questions that I'm playing out in the show in a lot of ways.
The title of the book is Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Sheau, would love to know your practice in relationship to writing, since you wrote in response to this show too, and you met in the writing class.
Yeah, so I work as a curator back where I'm from, mostly in Malaysia, and I also sort of started out as a writer before becoming a curator. I was doing a lot of research writing, I was doing a lot of sort of writing reviews, things like that, and then there are not many writers in Malaysia and even fewer curators, so that's how things happen. But I had always sort of approached writing, and growing up, the sort of only writing I knew was writing essays, writing prose. I had always sort of approached writing as a sort of utilitarian thing, as a way of communication. clarity in language and clarity in sentences was something that I really strove for when I was growing up. And I think in recent years, especially reading writers like Anna Singh, who wrote a book called Friction, writers like Ben Lerner, who is a sort of favorite of mine, there's a expansiveness in abstraction, not that abstraction is always a sort of like, abstraction and opaqueness I think are different things. There's an abstraction that can open up the sort of world of imagery and metaphor, and there's an abstraction that can make it less known. And you know, as writers, I think we're always aspiring to the sort of former kind of abstraction rather than the later. And sort of living in this space of understanding the kind of like impact of language, the sort of like abstract space of image, then allowed me to sort of tie a sort of deeper historical understanding to the way in which I write, think, and understand art. I come from a kind of very architectural history background, and that's my primary sort of instinct, to think about how the work is made by a situation, made by a place, but then how in turn the work itself can form a new relationship toward the, you know, context in which it is given and delivered. So my writing practice, I think, is at the end of the day still existing in a pretty discursive space, but hopefully one that is expansive in its imagination.
It definitely is, yeah. I think in the writing that I've observed you do, you've often found ways to go in and out of like the microscopic into like the scale of history so quickly in a way that feels incredibly fitting for being a person now. Like you very easily are able to allow someone to see the way that their personal interactions exist across historical time, and it's very cool. It's like, it's really wonderful actually, and that level of abstraction you have such good control over. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
I love the parts when you were writing about algae as the byproduct of our morality. I love the when you switched out the structure, the system into something that is inherently ingrained within us. Ray, I wonder if you have any response to Sheau's kind of presentation talk, the text just now, before we open it to the floor.
Honestly, it felt like a birthday present. Like it felt like it felt like a wonderful read alongside the work. So I think I was kind of floating, I felt very understood, and you articulated and named some things within the work that I have not been able to fully name. Like I know it's around, but is not named by me yet. So I guess I just felt very appreciative in the whole process. Something that I was thinking a lot about was this question of plantation, because when in class you had been talking about the plantation, and also the idea of like the fact that a plantation, the idea of the plantation needs to exist as like an extractive space. And so what happens now when there are less and less places to extract from? And sort of where do we extract from? And it's like, well, do we extract from the self? Do we extract more from the earth? Do we synthesize those materials? That kind of questioning, I think, came up a little bit for me, and I was hoping, I don't know, I guess I'm kind of like, I think the next chapter of this conversation feels like that's the direction, is like how do we talk about the plantation specifically in Malaysia, and how the British dealt with Malaysia, used Malaysia for so long. So yeah, so I guess that's what I was thinking about all that too.
Thank you. I guess I can also talk a little bit more about plantation cultures, but yeah, I mean, I think in America, when the word plantation is evoked, it's often in relation to a history of transatlantic slavery, right? Often in a relationship to the sort of way in which the South used black labor to sustain an unsustainable economy. And when slavery was slowly but eventually abolished, all of that cheap labor essentially moved offshore. And that in many ways is also the story of Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire, how sort of, you know, offshore, kind of a pointillist empire, I think in one of his words, or Ben Rankin, I think it was Rankin who said that, was able to form because of sort of American interests abroad. But Malaysia, where I'm from, was the sort of jewel of the British Empire in the 20th century, especially in its production of tin and rubber. It actually saved London from financial collapse after World War II in many ways as well. These sort of relationships of center and periphery become extremely, extremely complicated when we examine the plantation as a space of production and of wealth. And yeah, I mean, the plantation upholds many of the sort of like modern conveniences we know today, packaged food, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, this is kind of going nowhere, so I'm gonna stop here unless someone else has questions, and then I can talk way more.
我们观众有问题的话，可以现在是想问题提问题的一个时候。有吗？ You got questions? 那里有。
Hi, hello. Thanks for the talking. And I actually have a specific question about like the one of the word you're using, the protocol converter prototype, and I'm super interested in like the how you like the explaining or that protocol things, because I know like that's the infrastructure of the web. But also like why you're using the converter prototype here. So yeah, that's my question.
Great question. That actually comes from a secret lecture that I did like in January of last year. I was thinking about the internet, and in particular the fact I was thinking about the materiality of the internet and what it means to like basically, I was thinking about if we look at the fact that the internet uses protocols and then converts those protocols and then sends that information out to multiple other computers, I was thinking that might be considered similar to a form of queerness, like it functions in the same way that queer functions. If we like just look at it as a word, like the word queer takes in all of these identities and experiences and then tries to convert them into this singular thing. And if we think about queer in like running that same gamut, then is queer actually quite problematic, this idea of like endlessly converting and then arriving at this singular thing? I wanted to kind of throw that into the show, this question of like what does it mean to continually convert protocols, and what happens if we keep doing that? Will something that is perceived as maybe liberatory or good end up arriving at something that is problematic and extractive? And so I was sort of playing around with those questions. And with the light piece, I was thinking like, is it okay for me to send this light onto this building? I thought it was possible with that piece that I could, if the timing was right and if we put the mirrors in the wrong direction, really hurt someone's eyes. And so I was also thinking about that as like a kind of problematic issue of protocol conversion. So yeah, that's kind of where that comes from. Yeah.
还有问题吗？ I've got one on the question of intimacy. This is such a personal and intimate show, specifically on the third floor, which is also where Sheau kind of entered with this response and text. I wonder if the question of intimacy was at the beginning when you conceived and received the invitation for the show and conceived the concept for the show, because at the beginning you wanted to sail across the Pacific Ocean, and how we arrived at this exhibition now, and where the third floor is, as Sheau puts it, the deep sea moment, the deep ocean moment, the moment of such intimacy. I wonder what's your take on that now, halfway through this exhibition?
I think I feel more and more naked or something as the show continues. I think especially on the third floor, like as the images start to look more and more like myself and the way that my family looks in the more present tense, it feels very jarring or something to see. So in that way, I guess I feel a bit like I've set myself up for something, which is quite interesting. I don't feel bad necessarily about it, but it's a surprise. It wasn't what I was expecting. I kind of think at the outset of the show, I felt like, intimacy is a state. There's always going to be some layer or boundary. And I think as the show continues and as I continue to come back to Shanghai and see the show and see everybody here, I find myself more and more melding with the show, like it is less outside of myself. And that feels surprising and strange.
Do you feel that way about the avatar too?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, the avatar looks less and less like me as time goes on too, which is also quite interesting as my body continues to change, and that's fascinating too.
Yeah, there's also an estrangement as well as an intimacy.
Yeah, exactly.
That's maybe they're always holding hands.
Yeah, they need each other or something. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. This show is it's the biggest show I've ever done. It's the most work that I've ever shown together. It's the most serious my practice has ever been taken. It makes me very emotional, honestly. And it's been an incredible blessing. So in that way, yeah, I don't really know what I think about it, but I feel very good. I'm very happy.
On that note, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rain. Thank you so much, Sheau. Thank you, everyone. 谢谢大家。